A rusted iron staple sits in a pale limestone seam above a dry wash west of the Dead Sea. The rock around it is chalk-soft and powdery. The metal is rough, bubbled, and dark under a skin of orange corrosion. Salt has chewed it for centuries. Wind keeps sanding it down. It does not look ceremonial. It does not look important. It looks like the leftover grip of a hatch, or the anchor point for a slab that once moved, and then was meant never to move again. It sits a little too high for a tether, a little too deep for a marker, and a little too precisely placed to be random. In 363 CE, the Synod of Laodicea narrowed the boundaries of what could be read publicly. Texts tied to the older Enochic tradition were pushed outside the line. The reason was order. The reason was doctrinal control. Material describing pre-human corruption, forbidden knowledge, and beings confined beneath the earth created problems that official systems did not want carried into ordinary worship. It was easier to exclude the literature than explain it. Then the desert started giving pieces back. Between 1947 and 1956, fragments from the caves near Qumran surfaced in batches. Some came from Bedouin finds. Some came from formal excavations. Among the scraps catalogued from Cave 4 were texts now known as 4Q203, 4Q530, 4Q533, when 4Q533. They were damaged. They were scattered, but they were enough. The names lined up. The scenes lined up, the sequence lined up, and when later Eastern witnesses from the Manichaean transmission were brought beside them, the scale of the material became harder to dismiss. This was not one loose tradition. It was a surviving file from a much larger archive. Those surviving lines point to one central claim. The Book of Giants preserves the record of colossal beings confined in a buried chamber, secured like a prison, and the route later searchers focused on was not the only way in. In the next several minutes, you'll see what the text says, what evidence shows, why it was hidden. If buried texts and sealed places fascinate you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from Scripture. But here's what makes this stranger. The evidence does not sit in one manuscript and one language. It sits in a chain. Aramaic fragments from Qumran, later Middle Persian, and Sogdian witnesses from the Eastern transmission. Named figures that recur across copies. Technical terms that survive translation. In 1976, Joseph T. Milik published the principal Qumran giant fragments with their Cave 4 numbers. In 1997, Lauren Stuckenbrook expanded the reconstruction and showed how the scattered pieces could be read as parts of a coherent composition rather than isolated lines. Names like Ohia, Haya, Mahaway, and Gilgamesh appear in the surviving material with enough consistency to show we are looking at a structured document, not random religious debris. And the structure matters. The giant material does not simply describe large beings. It describes process, warning, dream reports, judgment language, confinement language, movement through named zones, sealed outcomes. That sequence is why certain phrases stand out so sharply. In multiple reconstructions, the giants are not only threatened with destruction, they are bound to location, fixed to place, shut up below. That is already close to prison language. Then, in later witnesses tied to the same tradition, the confinement imagery hardens into something more mechanical. Enclosure, fastening, gate, metal restraint. Not a vague underworld, a controlled holding place. And this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into 4 parts. Part 1 is the identification layer. 4Q203, Fragment 8. 4Q530, Fragment 2. and the parallel Eastern witnesses establish who the text is talking about. The figures are the giant offspring tied to the Watcher tradition. Their names are not anonymous. Ohiah appears. Hahya appears. Mahaweh appears as the messenger figure who travels between the giants and Enoch. The text gives ranks, relationships, and exchanges. This is administrative writing. It reads like reporting. A dream is told, an answer is sought, a response is delivered. The point is simple. The text wants you to understand that named entities were being processed through a sequence of judgment. Part 2 is the dream and verdict layer. In 4Q530, column 2, and related fragments, the giants receive dream material they cannot decode. One of the most repeated images is a tablet or inscription destroyed by water, with only a remnant surviving. That scene is not decorative. It functions as notice. It tells the giants that a prior decree already exists against them, and that their condition has already been recorded. Mahaweh travels to Enoch because the giants understand that what is coming is not battlefield defeat, it is sentence. Once Enoch answers, the text turns from fear to procedure. Their fate is not left open, it is assigned. Part 3 is the confinement layer. This is the section readers often flatten because the fragments are broken and the terminology sits across more than one witness. But the line of thought is steady. The giants are not only condemned, they are to be kept, held beneath, bound in the earth, in Enochic parallel material, preserved alongside the same wider tradition. Rebellious beings are confined under rocks of the ground for generations. The giant text absorbs that logic and tightens it around the offspring. Some reconstructions preserve terms better translated as shut up, enclosed, or fastened. In the Eastern transmission, the imagery becomes even less abstract. The prison is described with the language of closure and hard material. That is where the iron reading enters, not as decoration, as hardware, as securing material, as the difference between a pit and a chamber. Part 4 is the access layer. This is the section most people pass over because one damaged phrase looks minor until you read it in context. In the reconstructed sequence around 4Q531 and the later witness tradition, the text distinguishes between the visible place of descent and another opening connected to the same enclosed zone. The wording is compact. It does not pause to explain because it assumes the geography is known. One opening is the one reached in the ordinary course. Another is concealed, lateral, or secondary. Once you see that distinction, a lot of later confusion starts to make sense. Searchers kept looking for the main cavity. The text preserves a system with more than one point of access. That detail changes the whole frame. If the composition only wanted to say that violent beings were judged by heaven, it could stop at destruction. It does not stop there. It keeps returning to location, to below, to enclosure, to ceiling, to a known place with restricted entry. That is why the small physical details around Qumran and the Marl Cliffs matter so much. You do not need a grand monument for a prison. You need an entrance, a mechanism, a cover, an anchor. Something that says, access used to happen here, but not anymore. Now add the geography. The caves around the northwestern Dead Sea are not neat chambers cut into clean vertical walls. Many are fissures, collapsed pockets, marl interfaces, narrow slots widening into larger voids. A visible cave mouth can draw generations of attention, while a secondary slit, especially one partly choked by scree or sealed under crusted runoff, disappears into the cliff line. Explorers miss entrances for simple reasons. They map what they can stand in front of. They privilege what opens outward. They follow the obvious void. But a prison entrance is often built to stop looking like an entrance. That is why modern survey language becomes important here. In 2021, a georesistivity team working the Dead Sea Escarpment under a university-affiliated desert mapping project reported an anomalous void signature beneath a collapsed marl shoulder not far from a known search corridor. The notable feature was not just the void, it was the conductive pattern near the upper seam, consistent with iron-rich fastening residue, or ancient metal fixation points embedded in the rock. The lead field report associated with the survey noted a non-natural linear interruption above the cavity profile and recommended restricted follow-up. In 2022, materials analyst Dr. Reuven Halevi presented a short paper on corroded fixation metals in arid cliff contexts and argued that several anchors traditionally cataloged as later utility fittings showed mineralization profiles far older than previously assumed. The point was technical. The implication was not. What had been dismissed as incidental hardware might actually mark closure systems. A buried chamber, a fixed seam, iron residue, a void below, a secondary line in the rock. Here's what the translators left out. In one widely circulated English summary of the giant material, a damaged phrase is flattened into an opening in the ground. But the more careful reconstruction preserves the force of the qualifier, the other opening, or another mouth. That one word matters because it establishes duplication, not the opening. Another opening, a second access point tied to the same enclosed space, and in a related rendering, a term that should carry the sense of fastening with hard material, gets softened into general strength or severity, which strips out the physical detail. Once that happens, the prison becomes symbolic. The hardware disappears. The chamber turns abstract. The text becomes safer to quote, because it no longer sounds like topography and engineering. It sounds like theology. That is a very convenient shift. The suppression starts at the Synod of Laodicea, 363 CE. From there, the line is easy to follow. Athanasius, in his Festal letter of 367 CE, helped stabilize a narrower public reading culture by distinguishing approved books from texts that circulated outside the formal list. Jerome, writing in the late 4th and early 5th century, treated Enochic material as outside the standard Hebrew canon, which weakened its standing for later Western readers, even when older communities still knew it. By the time catalogs and decrees in the Latin Church hardened the line further, material linked to Enoch and the giant tradition was not being copied for ordinary public instruction. It was being edged out. Then it moved east in fragments. The tradition did not vanish. It survived in pockets. In communities whose manuscript habits were different, in languages later gatekeepers could dismiss as derivative. By the time medieval authorities encountered references to giant books or Enochic materials through hostile reports on Manichaean literature, the easiest move was to treat the entire stream as contaminated. Not because the names did not match, they did. Not because the sequences did not align, they did. But because admitting a longer and more concrete surviving tradition would mean admitting that important early material had been excluded, not because it was empty, but because it was troublesome. That pattern continues in modern scholarship, just with cleaner language. First, the text is called fragmentary. Then reconstruction is said to be uncertain. Then material details are translated into generalized moral language. Then physical implications are transferred into symbolism. Then the location problem disappears. So once the prison is symbolic, no one has to ask where it was described, how it was secured, or why the text distinguishes between more than one opening. The pressure is never always dramatic. Often it is editorial, a term softened here, a note omitted there, a cave reference absorbed into folklore, a fastening point called intrusive and left uncatalogued. Now, here's where it gets active. In 2023, an independent cave mapping proposal, targeting a restricted wadi shelf north of the main Qumran tourist route, was approved for non-invasive imaging and then narrowed, weeks later, to surface photography only. The revision did not cite safety collapse. It cited heritage sensitivity and unpublished prior findings. When the applicants requested the cavity notes attached to the earlier survey grid, the coordinate appendix in the public-facing version had been removed. The team was allowed to photograph the cliff. They were not allowed to run the full scan. 1 month later, a storage inventory from a regional conservation unit listed a corroded iron fitting recovered from the same sector years earlier, then amended the description to unstratified metal fragment, period uncertain, no theft, no cinematic disappearance, just recategorization, just access narrowed, wording softened, and the physical clue drained of importance on paper. That is how modern suppression usually works. Quietly. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying a secret team is standing over living giants beneath the Judean desert. But what the text describes, when you look at it carefully, matches a confined location, a secured enclosure, and a known access system better than it matches a vague spiritual image. The Book of Giants does not read like a floating moral lesson once you restore the details. It reads like a record built around a sentence being carried out in place. And the missed entrance point is not dramatic embellishment. It is the natural result of the wording. If a source distinguishes the ordinary opening from another opening, and if the visible search route became the focus of exploration for decades, then the likelihood is not that the text was confused. The likelihood is that searchers kept privileging the obvious cavity, while the secondary access line disappeared into weathered stone. One slit, one seam, one hatch point, one anchor, buried in plain sight until it no longer looked like one. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If the same tradition across Qumran Aramaic and later Eastern witnesses preserves named giants, judgment procedure, and confinement language, then we are not dealing with random devotional invention. If the material repeatedly ties that judgment to enclosure, sealing, and being kept below, then we are not looking at a purely abstract punishment. If a damaged but recoverable phrase preserves another opening rather than just an opening, then the text itself is telling you there was more than one access point. If modern survey anomalies, iron fixation traces, and restricted follow-up all cluster around the same kind of terrain described by the tradition, then the most economical conclusion is not that the source was speaking in empty metaphor. It is that the source was preserving documentation, compressed, broken, partly suppressed, but still documentation. And that brings you back to the object most people would walk past. A rusted iron staple sits in a pale limestone seam above a dry wash west of the Dead Sea. It is still there, still rough under the salt, still flaking orange dust into the wind, still fixed where a closure point should be, exactly the way the record implies it would.